A poem sits unfinished on a desk, its last line trailing into silence mid-thought, and the man who wrote it is 29 years old. Christopher Marlowe will be dead before the sun sets on the 30th of May, 1593, killed by a wound above his right eye in a private house in Deptford, and the poem will stay exactly as it is. In the late spring of 1593, London was living under plague, the theaters were shut, and a playwright named Christopher Marlowe, the most celebrated dramatist in England and very possibly a spy, was under active investigation by the Privy Council for blasphemy, a charge that could end a man's life. On the 30th of May, he spent the day at a house in Deptford with 3 men, all of them connected to the intelligence world of the Elizabethan state. By 6 in the evening, he was dead. A dagger, a wound, and a story about an argument over the bill. The inquest was completed in 2 days. The pardon for the man who struck the blow was issued in under 4 weeks. The document recording all of this was lost to history until 1925, when a historian found it sitting quietly in the Public Record Office, and the questions it raised have never been fully answered. This is the story of the Deptford Reckoning, the death of Christopher Marlowe, told gently, with care for the historical record and respect for a young man whose grave in the churchyard of St. Nicholas, Deptford, has no marker, and whose precise resting place no one alive today can name. Good evening and welcome. There will be no sudden sounds here, no raised voices, nothing to startle you from rest. If you find comfort in these stories and wish to follow us, please do. Close your eyes whenever you wish. Let your breathing slow. Let's begin. Chapter 1. His name was Christopher Marlowe. He was born in February 1564 in Canterbury, and he was baptized on the 26th of that month at the church of St. George the Martyr, in the same week, as it happens, that another boy was being baptized in Stratford-upon-Avon. He was the son of a shoemaker named John Marlowe, and there was nothing about his origins that suggested he would go anywhere remarkable. And yet he did. A scholarship took him to the King's School in Canterbury, where he received the kind of education that was usually reserved for the sons of men considerably wealthier than his father. Another scholarship, funded by the estate of Archbishop Matthew Parker, carried him from Canterbury to Cambridge, to Corpus Christi College, where he studied and argued and apparently spent a good deal of time doing things the college authorities didn't entirely approve of. He took his bachelor's degree in 1584. He returned for his master's, but by 1587 there was a problem. He had been absent from Cambridge too often, and the college was inclined to withhold his degree. Then something interesting happened. The Privy Council, the body that advised the Queen and ran the machinery of the Elizabethan state, sent a letter on his behalf. It said that Marlowe had been employed in matters touching the benefit of his country, and that he had done Her Majesty good service, and that his degree should be granted without further difficulty. The Privy Council did not usually concern itself with the academic credentials of Shoemaker's sons. The letter doesn't say what Marlowe had been doing. It doesn't need to. The listener can feel, I think, what it means. A young man from Canterbury, brilliant enough to be noticed, had been pulled into a world very different from the one he'd been born into, and that world had decided he was useful. He got his degree, and then he went to London. What he did in London was write plays, and the plays were unlike anything the English stage had seen before. He wrote in blank verse, a form that in his hands became something urgent and strange, a kind of speech that sounded like thinking, like ambition made audible. His first major work, Tamburlaine the Great, was performed sometime around 1587, and audiences who went to watch it found themselves in the presence of a voice that wanted to talk about what happens when a person refuses the limits placed on them. His Dr. Faustus asked the same question more darkly. What does a man give up when he reaches for everything? His Edward II was a study of power and its human cost, as intimate and uncomfortable as anything written for the Elizabethan stage. I think about what it means that Marlowe kept returning to these themes. The overreacher, the brilliant man who goes too far. Whether that was purely literary instinct or something more personal, I can't say for certain, and I don't think anyone can. But the pattern is there, and it's hard not to feel it. He was also, by the late 1580s, a man with a documented history of trouble. In 1589, he was involved in a street fight in which the poet Thomas Watson killed a man named William Bradley, and Marlowe spent a few weeks in Newgate prison as a result. In 1592, he was bound over to keep the peace in Shoreditch, following a complaint by 2 constables. These weren't the actions of a careful man. They suggest someone who moved through the world with a confidence that sometimes outran his circumstances. And then there is the poem. Hero and Leander is a narrative poem, rich and sensory and full of a delight in beautiful things. It tells the story of 2 young lovers separated by the sea, and it is, even now, 4 centuries after it was written, genuinely lovely to read. The publisher who brought it out after Marlowe's death was a man named Edward Blount, and in his dedication he described Marlowe as someone who had been dear unto us. That phrase, I think, is worth staying with for a moment. Not admired, not celebrated, though he was both. Dear. The word a person uses for someone they loved. The poem breaks off in the middle of a scene. It just stops. Blount didn't complete it, couldn't complete it. He published what there was, with that dedication, and left the gap where Marlowe's voice had been. He was 29 years old. He had a poem on the desk and a government investigation hanging over him, and on the 30th of May, 1593, he was in a house in Deptford with 3 men, and by evening he was dead. The questions about how and why have been argued over ever since, but I want to begin, and I want you to begin, not with the argument, but with the fact of the person. A shoemaker's son, from Canterbury, a boy who talked his way into Cambridge and then into the court's confidence and then on to the London stage. A man who was, by the testimony of someone who knew him well, genuinely dear. Chapter 2. By May of 1593, the London that Marlowe had built his career in was quieter than it should have been. The plague had been closing the theaters intermittently since around June of 1592, and by the spring of 1593, it was still at work in the city. The streets were not empty, but they had a different character than usual, the particular quality of a place where people are being careful, where the sound of a church bell carries a different weight. The city counted its dead in ways that were specific and regular, and the numbers were not reassuring. Some districts were harder hit than others. Movement was constrained. Bonfires were lit in the streets, the air carrying the particular smell of wood smoke and something sharper. The city's attempt to purify itself through burning. For Marlowe, the plague year was a practical crisis. His livelihood came from the theater, from plays being performed before paying audiences, and there were no paying audiences when the playhouses were shut. This put him in the position that most writers in this period eventually found themselves in, the position of needing a patron, someone wealthy and powerful enough to provide the support that the commercial stage could not. He had found one. Thomas Walsingham was a gentleman of Kent, with a house called Scadbury near Chislehurst, a cousin of the late Sir Francis Walsingham, who had been Elizabeth's spymaster for most of the previous 2 decades. Thomas Walsingham was not the most powerful man in England, but he was well connected, and he had a genuine interest in literature and in Marlowe specifically. It's thought that Marlowe may have been staying at Scadbury, or spending time there, in the weeks before his death. A house in the country, away from the plague-infected city, a patron who was genuinely interested in his work. It should have been a period of relative calm. It wasn't. Thomas Kidd was a playwright, roughly Marlowe's contemporary, and at some point the two men had shared lodgings. I think of that when I think about Kidd. The ordinary fact of it, two writers in the same rented rooms, probably arguing about plays, probably borrowing each other's candles. Whatever their friendship was, it was close enough that they lived together, and that matters because of what happened in May of 1593. Kidd was arrested. The authorities, investigating a document called the Dutch Church Libel, a piece of inflammatory verse that had been posted publicly and was causing official alarm, searched his rooms and found papers they considered heretical. Under questioning, and then under torture, Kidd said the papers weren't his. He said they belonged to Marlowe, left behind from when they had shared lodgings. Kidd's situation was desperate. Torture in this period was a real and systematic thing, not a rhetorical flourish, and a man under enough physical pressure will say what he believes will make it stop. Whether Kidd believed what he said about Marlowe, whether he was accurately reporting something, whether he was grasping at any explanation that might redirect the attention away from himself, I genuinely don't know. What I know is what his words did. They pointed toward Marlowe at a moment when Marlowe could least afford to be pointed at. Richard Baines was another matter. Baines was an informer by profession, a man who made part of his living supplying the state with intelligence about the activities and opinions of others. He and Marlowe had a prior history, not a friendly one. Some years earlier, both men had been implicated in a scheme to counterfeit coins in the Flemish city of Flushing. It's a strange detail, counterfeiting, the kind of thing that makes you look twice at the simplified version of Marlowe as a purely literary figure. It suggests that the world he moved in was more complicated than that the lines between playwright and intelligencer and opportunist were not always distinct. Whatever the nature of their prior relationship, by the spring of 1593, Baines was not Marlowe's friend. He submitted a document to the Privy Council, known now as the Baines Note, listing a series of statements he attributed to Marlowe. Denials of Christ's divinity, skeptical readings of Scripture, comments about Moses, about religion, about the nature of faith, all of them framed as blasphemy, all of them attributed to Marlowe as if they were established fact rather than an informer's report. Whether these were things Marlowe actually said, things said in private conversation that Baines was now weaponizing, things distorted or invented entirely, I can't tell you. What I can tell you is what they meant in 1593. Blasphemy was not a minor charge. It sat at the intersection of theology and politics in a way that made it genuinely dangerous. A man found guilty of denying the divinity of Christ was a man whose life was in serious jeopardy under the laws of the time. On the 18th of May, 1593, 12 days before the events at Deptford, Marlowe was arrested and brought before the Privy Council. He was released on bail. He was ordered to report daily to the council until they decided what to do with him. He walked out of that room still free, but the machinery of the state was now fully engaged with the question of who he was and what he believed. I want to introduce the three men who were with him at Deptford now, because the listener needs to understand them not as suspects, not yet, but as people, as the kind of people Marlowe's world produced and his circumstances gathered around him. Ingram Fraser was a business agent, the kind of man who made himself useful to powerful people in ways that didn't require a title or an estate. He worked primarily for Thomas Walsingham, Marlowe's own patron. His work involved financial transactions, property dealings, the management of money for men who preferred not to manage it themselves. Some of his dealings were straightforward. Some were not. He had been involved in a scheme in which a young man named Drew Woodliff ended up parted from a significant sum of money in circumstances that were, to say the least, not entirely transparent. Fraser operated in the gray space between service and exploitation, which was a recognizable and functional space in Elizabethan England, and he was good at it. Robert Poley was a different kind of figure. He was a professional intelligencer, which means he was a spy, and the word professional is not casual here. He had been involved in the exposure of the Babington Plot in 1586, the conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary Queen of Scots on the throne. His role in that affair had required him to spend months embedded among the conspirators, pretending to share their loyalties, feeding information back to the government, and eventually helping to ensure that the men he had befriended were arrested and executed. As part of his cover, he had spent time in the Tower of London. He had made himself a prisoner so convincingly that his imprisonment was part of the deception. I find Poley genuinely extraordinary to think about. A man whose professional life was built entirely on being someone other than who he was. A man for whom sustained deception was not a moral failure, but a skill set. On the 30th of May, 1593, a document would later establish that Poley was in Deptford on official government business, carrying letters for the Queen. He was there, in other words, in a professional capacity. Whether the nature of that professional capacity included anything beyond what the document says is one of the questions that has never been answered. Nicholas Skyrus is the third man, and he is, of the three, the one about whom the least is known. He was associated with the household of the Earl of Essex and had a history of involvement in money-lending schemes, some of them similar in character to Fraser's activities. He had also at various points been connected to intelligence work. He was present at Deptford on the 30th of May. Beyond that, the record is thin. And then there is Eleanor Bull. She was a widow, the owner of the house in Deptford, where these four men spent the 30th of May. The Inquest describes the house as hers, and it uses the Latin word domus, house, not taberna, tavern, which has led historians to discuss at some length whether her establishment was a private house, a house that received paying guests, or something in between. The distinction matters a little, but what matters more to me is who she was. Eleanor Bull was not an anonymous innkeeper. She had family connections to Blanche Parry, one of the senior ladies of the Queen's own bedchamber, one of the women who had served Elizabeth most closely and most loyally for decades. That connection placed Eleanor Bull, a widow in Deptford, within a traceable distance of the court itself. She was not someone who ran a tavern for strangers. She was someone whose house was chosen for a purpose, on a particular day, for a meeting that clearly had some meaning beyond a casual gathering. She is not recorded as a witness in the inquest. If she gave testimony, it doesn't survive. After the 30th of May, 1593, Eleanor Bull disappears from the record as entirely as if she had not been there at all. And all of this, every one of these people, their connections, and their histories, and the worlds they moved in, is the context for a single afternoon in a house in Deptford, where a man who had been dear unto his publisher sat with three men and did not come home. Chapter 3. The last time Marlowe is confirmed in the official record before the 30th of May is the 20th of May, when he appeared before the Privy Council in fulfillment of his bail conditions. He was released again. He was told to continue reporting daily. What happened between the 20th and the 30th of May, I can't tell you, because the record doesn't say. 10 days. He may have been at Scadbury with Walsingham. The daily reporting requirement may have lapsed, or if he was attending, no record of those attendances survives. The gap is simply there, a space of 10 days in a man's life, unremarkable to the people living through it and invisible to everyone who has looked since. What I find myself thinking about is that 10 days. He was 29 years old, under investigation for blasphemy. The theaters were shut, the city was sick, and he had a poem on the desk. What does a person think about in 10 days like those? Whether he was frightened, I can't say. Whether he knew what was coming, I can't say. What I know is that he was alive, and then he wasn't. On the morning of the 30th of May, the four men gathered at Eleanor Bull's house. The inquest tells us it was morning when they met. It was late May, which means the days were long, the light coming early and staying late, the sun not setting until after 8 in the evening. There would have been time, a great deal of time, between the arrival of 4 men at a house and whatever happened at the 6th hour after noon. I think about that day as the inquest describes it, and what strikes me is how ordinary it sounds. They ate together, they walked in the garden, they came back indoors. They ate again. It has the rhythm of a long, quiet day, the kind of day that happens in late May when there is nowhere in particular to be. The light in the garden, the sound of the river not far off, the dockyard sounds, the ordinary noise of a working waterfront. Whatever conversation passed between 4 men over the course of a May day, it is not recorded anywhere. Whatever business brought them together, if it was business, has left no trace in any document that survives. The inquest records the time of what happened next as the 6th hour after noon, which is approximately 6 o'clock in the evening. They had been together, by then, for the better part of a day. What the inquest says happened is this. A dispute arose over the reckoning. The bill, in other words, for the food and drink of the day. Marlowe was lying on a bed. He seized Fraser's dagger from his belt and struck Fraser twice on the head with it. The wounds to Fraser's head were described as 2 inches long and 1/4 of an inch deep, painful but not fatal. Fraser was sitting at the table between Scarce and Poley and could not retreat. He struggled with Marlowe for the dagger. In that struggle, he inflicted a wound above Marlowe's right eye, 2 inches long, 2 inches deep into the skull. Marlowe died instantly. I want to say that plainly, and then I want to sit with the silence after it for a moment, because I think that's what the story asks. 2 inches deep. The inquest uses the Latin phrase, mortuus erat et ibidem instanter, obit. He was dead, and there in that place he died instantly. A sentence in a legal document, composed within 2 days of the event it describes, and in it a man's life ends in the space between 2 subordinate clauses. The violence itself was brief. The silence after it must have been very long. The account I've just given you comes entirely from the 3 men who survived it. Fraser, Poley, and Scarce were the only people in that room, and they were the only witnesses to the inquest. There is no independent corroboration. Eleanor Bull, if she heard anything, if anyone in the house heard anything, is not in the record. The coroner's process in this period was not designed to investigate. It was designed to establish cause of death and assign legal responsibility. It took the testimony of available witnesses and reached a finding. The finding was self-defense. I'm not telling you that because I think the inquest was dishonest. I'm telling you because it matters to hold that clearly in mind. What we have is one account, given by the men who would have been held legally responsible if the account had gone differently, and we have no way of knowing what is missing from it. Chapter 4. The inquest was held on the 1st of June, 1593. That is the same day Marlowe was buried. He had been dead for 2 days. William Danby was the coroner of the household, which was a specific royal appointment, distinct from the county coroner. His jurisdiction covered deaths occurring within 12 miles of wherever the Queen currently was. On the 30th of May, 1593, the Queen was at Greenwich. Deptford was inside that radius. Whether this was simply the routine operation of the law, or whether it had some significance for how the inquest was conducted, is one of the things that historians have noticed but cannot resolve. 16 local men were impaneled as the jury, men from the community of Deptford, men who would have known the parish and the church. They heard the testimony. They examined the findings. They returned their verdict that Ingram Fraser had killed Christopher Marlowe in self-defense, and that Marlowe had been the aggressor. Fraser was taken into custody pending a royal pardon. On the 1st of June, 1593, while the inquest was sitting, Christopher Marlowe was buried in the churchyard of St. Nicholas, Deptford. The burial register of that church records the entry. It reads, Christopher Marlowe slain by Francis Fraser. The name is wrong. The man's name was Ingram Fraser, not Francis. Why the register records the wrong name is not known. A slip of the pen, a misheard name, something else. The error is just there, a small, wrong note in a sparse and functional document, the last official record of a person's existence in the world. On the 28th of June, 1593, less than 4 weeks after the killing, Queen Elizabeth granted Ingram Fraser a formal pardon. It confirmed the inquest's finding of self-defense. Fraser was released. He returned to the service of Thomas Walsingham, Marlowe's own patron, and he stayed in that service for years. In later life, he was a church warden in Eltham, which is a detail I find quietly remarkable. A man who killed Christopher Marlowe in a house in Deptford went on to be a church warden. He had a life. A long, ordinary, documented life. The Privy Council's investigation into Marlowe's alleged blasphemy simply stopped. There are no further proceedings recorded. The case that had been building against him, the Baines note, Kidd's testimony, the daily reporting requirement, it all just ceased, because there was no longer anyone to proceed against. The story, for a time, passed into the noise of popular memory, and popular memory got it almost entirely wrong. The writer William Beard, writing in 1597, described Marlowe as having been stabbed to death in a street fight over a woman. Francis Mears, writing in 1598, said he had been stabbed by a body-serving man, a rival in his lewd love. A street, a woman, a body-serving man. None of it is accurate. None of it matches the inquest, the house, the reckoning, the wound above the right eye. These early accounts suggest that the true circumstances of Marlowe's death were either not widely known or were being told in a form that simplified and moralized the story, or possibly were being deliberately obscured. I can't tell you which. What I can tell you is that within just a few years of the event, the accurate account had already disappeared from circulation, and the inquest document that contained it had gone into the archive, where it would sit, unread and unnoticed, for over 300 years. Thomas Kidd, who had named Marlowe to his torturers, died the following year. He was broken by the arrest and its aftermath, his health ruined, his reputation damaged beyond recovery. He was in his early 30s. He had been a significant playwright, author of The Spanish Tragedy, one of the most popular plays of the period. He died in poverty. The accusation he made under duress, whether it was true or not, did not save him. And Christopher Marlowe lay in the churchyard of St. Nicholas, in ground that the plague year was filling faster than anyone would have liked, in an unmarked grave whose precise location no one thought to record, because in 1593 no one could have anticipated that 400 years later people would still be asking questions. Chapter 5. In 1925, a historian named Leslie Hodson was working in the Public Record Office in London, which is now the National Archives, and he found something. The inquest document had been there the entire time, sitting in the archive for 332 years, a piece of parchment with writing on it, filed away and not looked for because no one had known to look for it. Hodson was not looking for it specifically, or not exactly. He was searching for documents related to Marlowe's death, following a thread in the records. And there it was. The official account of the 30th of May, 1593. The names of the 4 men, the description of the day, the wound, the verdict, the pardon. I find something quietly moving about that moment, a scholar's hand on a document that no one had read in over 3 centuries, the words coming back into the world they had been removed from. Hodson published his findings that same year, and the modern period of research into Marlowe's death began. What the document changed is this. We now know the official account. We know the names, the sequence of events as recorded, the legal outcome. Before Hodson's discovery, the true circumstances were effectively unknown to scholarship. What the document opened is a different matter, because the official account, once you have it, generates questions that the official account cannot answer. The first and most straightforward reading of the inquest is that it is substantially accurate. A dispute over a bill, a man on a bed seizing a dagger, a struggle, a fatal wound. The wound itself is consistent with exactly what the inquest describes. A close-quarters struggle over a blade, a wound inflicted by a man who could not retreat. The speed of the pardon is not necessarily suspicious. The inquest had already established self-defense, and the pardon was the routine legal consequence of that finding. Fraser returning to Walsingham's service is consistent with the man who had been involved in an unfortunate incident and was now resuming his ordinary life. This reading asks you to believe that 4 men with intelligence connections spent a day in a house together for reasons that were social or personal, that a trivial argument escalated into violence, and that the man at the center of the story died by accident, or at least without premeditation. It's not an implausible reading. Trivial arguments do escalate. Days of eating and drinking do produce tensions. The simplest explanation is often the right one, and the simplest explanation here is that Christopher Marlowe died in a stupid quarrel over who was going to pay for dinner. But the second reading is harder to set aside. The historian Charles Nicholl spent years working through the intelligence networks of the 1590s, and his book on the subject, published in 1992, makes a sustained and careful argument that the meeting at Deptford was not accidental and not social. He traces the connections: Fraser to Walsingham, Poley to the highest levels of state intelligence, Skeers to Essex's household. All 3 men present at a meeting with a playwright who was under active investigation for blasphemy, in a house whose owner had connections to the royal court, on a day when that playwright happened to die. Nicholl's argument is not that the inquest is straightforwardly false. It's subtler than that. He suggests that the reckoning dispute may have been a narrative constructed to satisfy the legal requirements of a self-defense verdict, that the meeting had a purpose connected to the intelligence world of the period, and that Marlowe's death served interests that extended beyond the 3 men in the room. The specific political context he identifies involves the rivalry between Robert Cecil and the Earl of Essex, and the way in which Marlowe, through his connection to Walsingham and his intelligence work, had become an inconvenient figure. I find Nicole's argument compelling in parts and difficult to verify in others. He is careful, and the connections he draws are real connections, documented in the records. The problem is that circumstantial connection is not the same as evidence of intent. That all three men had intelligence backgrounds tells us something about the world these people moved in. It doesn't tell us that they were in that room for a reason other than the one the inquest gives. The speed of Freezer's pardon tells us that the official process moved quickly. It doesn't tell us whether the process was serving its proper function or serving something else. What I keep returning to is this. There was a Privy Council investigation into Marlowe. It was active and serious, and it was based on accusations from two sources. One of them a man with a personal grievance, and the other a man who had given testimony under torture. The investigation ended with Marlowe's death. Fraser, who killed him, worked for the same patron who had sheltered Marlowe during the plague. The inquest was conducted by a royal official whose jurisdiction applied specifically because of the Queen's location, and the whole thing was over in 2 days. I'm not going to tell you that I know what happened. I don't. No one does. What I know is that the official account is the only account, and it was produced by people with a clear interest in how it came out, and that even if every word of it is true, it cannot answer the question of why those 4 men were together that day. There is a third theory, one that surfaces periodically in popular culture, that Marlowe faked his death and went abroad and continued to write under another name. I mention it because it exists and because some people find it fascinating, but I want to be honest with you. Most serious historians don't think it's credible. The coroner's jury examined a body. A body was buried in Deptford. There is no documentary trace of Marlowe anywhere after the 30th of May, 1593. And the absence of such a trace, across decades, across multiple document streams, is not consistent with a living man who continued to be prolific and who had people who cared about him. What the case reveals, finally, is something about the limits of the historical record itself. The coroner's inquest was not designed to answer the questions that 4 centuries of scholarship would ask of it. It was designed to establish cause of death and assign legal responsibility, and it did both of those things within 2 days. The question of why a gathering of intelligence-connected men occurred on the same afternoon that a playwright under investigation for blasphemy happened to die is not a question the inquest's legal framework was built to ask. And so we are left where we are, with a document that tells us the official account and nothing beyond the official account, with connections that suggest the world was more complicated than any single account can hold, with 3 men who went home that evening and lived their lives and did not, as far as we know, write anything down about what had actually happened, with a poem that stops mid-sentence and a publisher who described the man who wrote it as dear unto us, and a churchyard in Deptford where the ground still holds what it was given in the summer of 1593. Chapter 6. The churchyard of St. Nicholas, Deptford, still exists. The church itself still stands. A medieval building with later additions, heavy stone, the kind of structure that endures because it was built to endure, not out of any particular pride, but because that was simply how churches were built. It's a Grade 1 listed building now, which means it is considered to be of the greatest significance. Irreplaceable, not to be altered. It has outlasted the dockyard, the plague, and 400 years of the city changing around it. Somewhere in the ground of that churchyard, Christopher Marlowe was buried on the 1st of June, 1593, 2 days after he died. In a year when the city was counting its dead, when the burial registers were full, when the ground was receiving more than its usual share of the people who had lived in the parish, the exact spot is not known. It was never marked. There is a memorial tablet inside the church, placed there in the 20th century, but the grave itself has no marker, and no one living today knows precisely where it is. I find myself thinking about that, and about the word dear. Edward Blount, publishing Hero and Leander in 1598, 5 years after Marlowe's death, wrote a dedication that speaks of the impression of the man that hath been dear unto us. 5 years on, and the present tense hath been, carrying both the past and its weight in a single phrase. Blount was a publisher, not a poet, and publishers don't write dedications like that for writers they didn't genuinely care about. He missed him. That comes through. I think about Thomas Walsingham, too, sitting at Scadbury in Kent, having received whatever news came from Deptford on the evening of the 30th of May, or the morning of the 31st. A patron who had sheltered a playwright during the plague. A man who, 2 days later, had a patron's obligation to bury what had been, by the evidence of those who knew them, something like a friendship. What Walsingham knew about that day, and when he knew it, is not documented. He continued to employ Ingram Fraser, the man who struck the blow. What that means, or doesn't mean, I can't say with certainty. I can say that the silence in the record around Walsingham in those weeks is very complete. Marlowe was 29. His major works were already written, already in circulation, already changing how people thought about what theater could do. Tamburlaine, Faustus, Edward II, the poem about Hero and Leander that nobody would ever finish for him. What he might have written in the years between 29 and 50, or 60, or whatever age he might have reached, we can't know. The question doesn't really have an answer. But it's one of the questions I find myself sitting with, all the same, the way you sit with any question that has no resolution. He was a shoemaker's son from Canterbury who had talked his way into Cambridge and into the confidence of the Elizabethan state and onto the London stage, and he had written some of the most extraordinary plays in the English language before he was 30, and on an afternoon in late May he was in a room in Deptford with 3 men and a dagger, and by the 6th hour afternoon he was dead, and by the morning of June the 2nd he was in the ground. The Thames still moves past Deptford. The dockyard that gave the settlement its particular sound and smell has been gone for a long time, replaced by other uses, the waterfront changed beyond recognition. But the river itself is there, the same river, moving the way it moved on the afternoon of the 30th of May, 1593, carrying everything past without comment, indifferent to argument and theory and the questions that people are still asking 4 centuries later. And in the churchyard of St. Nicholas, in the quiet, enclosed space that the church has kept around itself while the city moved and changed on every side, the ground holds what it was given. Somewhere beneath that grass, in a place that no marker names and no living person can point to, Christopher Marlowe rests. A young man who was dear to those who knew him. A mind that reached as far and as hard as any mind of his time. A poem that stops. The exact spot is not known. The ground remains. I keep returning to the poem, even after everything else. Hero and Leander was not the only thing Marlowe left unfinished, of course. There was a translation of Lucan's Pharsalia, a classical Latin epic about civil war, which suggests a mind still reaching into new territory. There were the plays themselves, several of which exist in forms that scholars continue to argue about, texts whose authority and completeness are uncertain. versions copied down from memory or assembled from different sources, the imperfect survival of words that were written to be spoken aloud and that only partially made it through to paper. But it is the poem that stays with me most, because of what Blount wrote about it, and because of the way it stops. Blount published Hero and Leander in 1598. He dedicated it to Sir Thomas Walsingham, the same Thomas Walsingham who had been Marlowe's patron, the man who had sheltered him during the plague year, the man who had continued to employ Ingram Fraser after the killing. The dedication is brief, as dedications of that period often were, but it carries something in it that most dedications don't. Blount writes that he thought it a far better tribute of his love and memory than to have stifled it in his bowels, in reference to the poem, to publishing it rather than keeping it. He describes Marlowe as having been dear unto us. He speaks of the impression of the man, and then he presents the poem, incomplete, to the world. He didn't commission a completion. He could have. George Chapman, another poet of the period, eventually completed Hero and Leander, and his continuation was published the following year, in 1598, in a combined volume. But Blount's instinct, the one that had produced his original dedication, was not to fill the gap. It was to present it honestly, as an incomplete thing, and to say something true about the person who had left it that way. I think that instinct was right. Not because Chapman's continuation is bad, it isn't, but because the incompleteness of what Marlowe left is part of what he left. A poem that stops is a different object than a poem that was completed by someone else. The stopping is part of the truth of it. And this is where I find myself, after all of the documented facts, after the inquest and the pardon and the burial register with its wrong name, not at the wound above the right eye, not at the reckoning dispute, not at the question of why 3 intelligence-connected men were in a house in Deptford on that particular afternoon. I find myself at the poem, at the space where the next line should have been. Chapter 7. I want to spend a little more time with the people who were left behind, because they are part of this story, and they tend to be overshadowed by the questions about the day itself. Thomas Walsingham lived until 1630. He was a man of Kent, a patron of letters, someone who moved in circles that valued literature and its people, and he outlived Marlowe by 37 years. What he made of those years, what he carried from the summer of 1593, we don't know. He had Ingram Fraser back in his service within weeks of the killing, and he kept him there. Whether that was the action of a man who trusted Fraser, a man who was loyal to someone who had served him, a man who felt some obligation or some guilt, or simply a man who needed a competent agent and Fraser was available, I can't tell you. The record shows the continuity of service. It doesn't illuminate the mind behind it. Ingram Fraser, as I mentioned, became a church warden. He died in 1633, 40 years after the events in Deptford. His life after the killing was, by every measure we have access to, ordinary. He managed his employer's affairs. He was involved in the community of his parish. He attended to the duties that a man of his social position was expected to attend to. If he thought about the 30th of May, 1593, and I assume on some occasions he did, he left no record of what those thoughts were. Robert Poley continued in intelligence work for years after Marlowe's death. He was still active in service as late as 16 or so, carrying messages, maintaining his networks, doing the work that his particular talents made him suited for. He had spent his adult life being other than who he was, and there is something in that I find very difficult to hold in my mind for long. Not that he was dishonest in a simple sense, or evil, or even particularly unusual in the world he moved in. But that a person can construct a life so entirely out of professional deception and continue in it for decades, growing older in it, carrying whatever private self exists beneath the performance of so many other selves. If Poley had a private self that he was honest with, the record doesn't show it. He is, in every document, a function, a carrier, a man sent somewhere for a purpose. Nicholas Skeers disappears from the record relatively quickly after Deptford. He was in trouble in the late 1590s, connected to various financial schemes that went badly, and the last mentions of him are not flattering ones. He was not, in the end, a man who prospered. Eleanor Bull is the absence at the heart of the supporting cast, the person who is most present in terms of physical location and most absent in terms of voice. She provided the space where the day happened. She was in that house on the 30th of May, or very likely was, in the way that the owner of a house is present in a house whether or not they are in the room where something important occurs. And then she is simply not in the record. No testimony. No account of what she heard, or saw, or knew. She continues to appear in documents relating to her own life for some years afterward, leasing property, attending to ordinary business. But about that day, about those 4 men, and what they did in her house and what the day became, she left nothing, or if she did leave something, it hasn't survived. I wonder about her sometimes, whether she knew what kind of men she was receiving that day, what she understood about the world they moved in, whether she saw anything that afternoon from a window, in the garden, passing a doorway, whether anyone asked her what she knew. The inquest did not call her. The inquest called the 3 surviving men, and that was sufficient for its legal purposes. Eleanor Bull's knowledge of the 30th of May, 1593, went with her when she died, like most of what people know about any given day in their lives. Thomas Kidd died in August of 1594, a little over a year after Marlowe. He was 35 or 36 years old. His health had been broken by the arrest and whatever followed from it. His reputation had not recovered. He had written one of the most popular plays of the Elizabethan period, the Spanish Tragedy, and that play would go on being performed and read and studied long after his death. But he died in poverty, in obscurity relative to what he had achieved, the arc of his life bent permanently out of shape by the events of 1593. I hold Kidd's story alongside Marlowe's not because I think Kidd is a villain in the piece. I don't think the framework of villain is useful here. Kidd was a man under torture who said something that could be used against someone else. Almost anyone would. The machinery that put him in that position was the same machinery that was closing around Marlowe, and neither of them had designed it or had any real power to resist it. They were both, in different ways, expendable to the forces that were using them. Kidd was damaged and survived, briefly. Marlowe was killed, and the investigation that had been building against him dissolved as if it had never existed. Whether there is a meaningful connection between those 2 facts is precisely the question that cannot be answered. I think about Richard Baines, too. His note to the Privy Council, the document listing all the things he claimed Marlowe had said, was the most formally dangerous piece of evidence in the case against Marlowe. It was specific, it was attributed, it was the kind of document that could serve as the foundation for a prosecution. After Marlowe's death, Baines was apparently executed, in 1594 for reasons unconnected to any of this, a crime of a different kind entirely. He did not live to see what became of the note he had submitted. Whether that matters to the story, I'm not sure. It's one of those historical adjacencies. 2 men whose paths crossed in a document, both dead within a year, neither of them knowing how the other story ended. The Baines note itself survived, It's in the archive, part of the documentary record of the Privy Council investigation. Scholars have read it and argued about it. Whether it represents genuine intelligence about Marlowe's actual views, a selective and weaponized version of overheard conversation, or something more fabricated, the argument continues. What isn't in dispute is that it worked, in the sense that it reached the people it was intended to reach and became part of an official case. And then the official case ended because the man at its center was dead. I find this all, in the end, more sad than it is mysterious. Not because the mystery isn't real, it is, and Nichols' research and the research of others who have worked on this question deserve to be taken seriously. But because the sadness is the more durable thing. A young man who was genuinely brilliant, genuinely useful to the state in ways he couldn't always control, genuinely dear to people who knew him, ended up in a room in Deptford with 3 men on a May afternoon and didn't come out. Whether it was an accident or wasn't, whether the meeting was innocent or wasn't, the outcome was the same. He was 29. He was done. That is what I keep sitting with. Chapter 8. His plays outlived him, and that matters, because in 1593 there was no guarantee they would. The question of theatrical texts in the Elizabethan period is complicated. Plays were not always written down in the form we think of as a finished text. They were written to be performed, and performance was the primary form they existed in. Published versions, quarto editions, were produced for various reasons, some authorized by the playwright, some not, some reconstructed from memory, some pirated, some genuinely representative of what the author intended, and some very much not. The survival of Marlowe's major works required a series of small accidents of preservation and publication, things going right, things not being lost, printers making decisions. Tamburlaine was published in 1590, while Marlowe was still alive, in a quarto edition. Dr. Faustus is a more complicated case. The earliest surviving text dates from 1604, over a decade after Marlowe's death, and there is a later and longer version from 1616, and scholars have spent a great deal of time arguing about which is closer to what Marlowe wrote and intended. Edward II was published in 1594, a year after his death. Hero and Leander, as I've described, in 1598. The point is that his work survived, imperfectly and through a series of contingencies, but it survived. And it shaped what came after it in ways that are hard to overstate. The blank verse that Marlowe fashioned into a vehicle for the stage, the particular pitch of ambition and darkness and intellectual intensity that characterizes his plays, set a standard and a tone that everyone who wrote for the stage afterward was working in relation to, including, some people argue, the writer who had been baptized in Stratford-upon-Avon in the same week as Marlowe in February of 1564. The relationship between Marlowe and Shakespeare is its own separate conversation, one I'm not going to spend much time on here, but I want to acknowledge it briefly because it's part of understanding what Marlowe's life and death mean in context. They were contemporaries, the same age almost to the week, working in the same city, in the same form. Shakespeare began to dominate the stage in the early 1590s, in the years before Marlowe's death, and the relationship between their work, the influences, and the divergences is something literary scholars have traced carefully and continue to trace. Whether they knew each other personally is not established by any direct evidence, though in a city of that size, working in overlapping theatrical worlds, it would be surprising if they had not at least been aware of each other. Whether Shakespeare's career would have looked the same if Marlowe had lived to be 50 is one of those questions that has no answer, and perhaps doesn't need one. What we can say is that Marlowe's work is where certain things began. A kind of seriousness about what the stage could do. A willingness to put the genuine complexity of power and desire and faith and doubt in front of an audience and ask them to sit with it. That is part of what was lost in 1593. Not just the poem on the desk, not just the particular plays that might have been written in the 30 or 40 years that Marlowe might have had. The specific lens of his mind, the way he looked at things, the particular combination of classical learning and street-level pragmatism, and something approaching recklessness that made his work feel unlike anything else. That particular lens was gone. And yet here we are 4 centuries and more later, and people are still reading him, still performing him, still arguing about how he died. There is something in that continuity that I find genuinely comforting, in a quiet way. Not triumphant, not redemptive in any simple sense, but evidence of something, that the work was real enough, and strong enough, and strange enough, that it persisted through all the contingency and accident of 4 centuries, and is still here, still recognizable as itself, still capable of doing what he built it to do. I think about Edward Blount publishing that poem in 1598, with the dedication that speaks of the impression of the man, and I think about the impression that has lasted past Blount, past the Elizabethan stage, past the English Civil War, and the Restoration, and the Industrial Revolution, and the 20th century, and into now, when someone is reading these words in the quiet of wherever they are, and Christopher Marlowe is still a felt presence in the room. That is a kind of survival, an imperfect one, incomplete, full of gaps and wrong names and lost documents and arguments that will never be resolved, but real, all the same. Chapter 9. I want to come back, at the end, to Canterbury. John Marlowe, the shoemaker, had a son baptized in February of 1564, and that son left Canterbury on a scholarship and never came back, not really, not to stay. But Canterbury is where the story begins, and I find it useful to return there in my mind, to the beginning rather than the end. The King's School, where Marlowe received the education that changed the trajectory of his life, still exists. It is one of the oldest schools in England, and its connection to Canterbury Cathedral gives it a weight of history that most institutions don't carry. A boy from a shoemaker's household, clever enough to be noticed, was given a place there, and the place led to Cambridge, and Cambridge led to London, and London led to the stage, and to the intelligence work, and eventually to the house in Deptford. The whole chain of it started with someone, probably a schoolmaster or a churchman, noticing that a child was unusually capable and deciding to do something about it. I don't know who that person was. The record doesn't say, but they changed things, in the way that people sometimes do when they notice something in a child and act on it. Whoever they were, they set in motion the career of a playwright, and the intelligence work of a spy, and the writing of Dr. Faustus, and the composition of the poem that breaks off in the middle of a scene, and the whole long argument about a May afternoon in Deptford that has been running ever since. These chains of consequence are everywhere in history, unnamed people making small decisions that become enormous in retrospect, and we almost never know who they were. We know Marlowe. We know the plays and the poem and the note from the Privy Council and the Inquest document. But we don't know who looked at a shoemaker's son in Canterbury and decided he was worth investing in. He was worth investing in. The record is clear about that, even if the record is unclear about almost everything else. The ground of St. Nicholas Churchyard in Deptford holds the last of what was physical about Christopher Marlowe, in a spot that cannot be named. The church itself stands, solid and enduring, in a part of southeast London that has been remade many times over in the 4 centuries since his burial. The dockyard that shaped the neighborhood for so long is gone. The maritime world that made Deptford what it was in 1593 has been replaced by other lives, other uses. The waterfront changed into something Marlowe wouldn't recognize. But the church is there. The churchyard is there. The Thames is there. And here is what I want to leave with you, as the quietest possible summary of a story that has no quiet resolution. A young man from Canterbury, who was genuinely loved by the people who knew him, wrote some of the most powerful plays in the English language before he was 30. He worked in a world that asked things of him that the theater alone couldn't explain, and he moved between those worlds with a confidence that occasionally outran his circumstances. He was under serious legal pressure in the last weeks of his life. He spent a May day in a house in Deptford with 3 men, and by evening he was dead, and the official account of how that happened was produced in 2 days by the people who survived it, and lost for over 300 years, and the questions it raises when you read it have never been fully answered. The poem he left unfinished is still unfinished. It was finished by someone else, later, but the original break in it is still there if you know where to look. The place where Marlowe's voice stops and someone else's begins. It is a small thing, in one sense, a few lines of poetry that were never written, but it is also a precise record of interruption, of a mind in mid-thought, and there is something in that specificity that seems to me more honest than any conclusion I could offer. He was dear unto those who knew him. He rests in ground that holds him without a name. The Thames moves past without comment. And somewhere in the quiet of a church in Canterbury there is a record of a baptism in February of 1564, and the name written there, in the handwriting of whoever held the pen that day, is Christopher Marlowe, and the name is correct, and it has been there ever since. You have been very good company tonight, and I'm glad you were here for this story. I hope the quiet of it has served you well. Rest well. A peaceful night to you.